Hello, everybody. In this episode, we're going to talk about the new Boeing pilot and technician outlook for the next 20 years. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to avionicsEducation.com. My name is Bruce Bissett. In this episode, we're going to talk about the new Boeing Pilot and Technician Outlook report that just came out. What this report does is it talks about the needs of the aviation industry over the next 20 years when it talks about pilots or operations and when it talks about mechanics, the need for mechanics in the industry. Hey, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like what I do here, don't forget to hit the like button. And also share it with a friend. So let's get to the report. So the pilot and technician report that came out is for the projected time period from 2022 to 2041. And this has been trending up over the years, and it has to do with the fact that a lot of technicians and pilots are reaching that retirement age. Now, pilots actually in the air carrier world have a mandatory date that they have to retire. And that is today, I believe it's age 65. It used to be age 60. They did raise it up because they were worried about the shortage. Now, they're hitting 65, and we're still flying. Now, the pandemic has actually slowed things down in recent years when it came to demand for technicians. In fact, basically, since the industry was shut down, nobody was hiring. But the drawback to that is a lot of people that were at that retirement age that were staying with the industry before COVID hit have now decided to say, you know what, I like being off. So they've taken the retirement. So a lot of the technicians that came into the industry with me 40 years ago are now at the point where they're ready to hang up their toolbox and go hang out by the lake and fish for the rest of their life. The problem is that through the years, there hasn't been that much in the way of motivation for the aviation industry. In fact, the aviation industry has to compete with a lot of other industries that need people, particularly high tech, or even the skill sets, dealing with labor shortages that we have throughout the country. Now, what's special about aviation is the fact that I can't go through and say, you know what, I want to get a job in aviation today. The problem is that there's a process to get that entry-level job, much less any good job in aviation. And I've always said in the 40 years that I've been in aviation, as long as I could work on an airplane or fly an airplane, that's a good day for me because I've really enjoyed the career. It's never been a labor for me because I've always had opportunities. I took a lot of jobs that would hire me as entry level, especially out of the Air Force when I didn't know much. But then as I got skilled and I got certification, I got better jobs and more interesting jobs. I can't say they were good or bad. It was just interesting. So now fast forward, we've now come to a point where a lot of the mechanics, especially after Vietnam, the last time we had a big bunch of mechanics that were put into the systems was at the end of the Vietnam War when they were using their VA benefits to get the trade schools to be able to get their A&P mechanic to come into the aviation. Also at the same time, 70s through the late 80s. Now we had to get through a recession in the early 80s. But after the early 80s, all those Vietnam-aged mechanics that went to school and got their EMPs got to take advantage of the booming aviation industry we had that ran basically from the late 80s through, I'll probably say, through the first Gulf War. And this industry has always had ebbs and flows. And I'm going to talk about that in another video. And we're talking about the lifespan, the life cycles of the aviation industry. So getting back to the report that I have here, the Pilot Outlook Report, and it talks about technicians too, but it talks about technicians in a blanket format. It just goes through and says, okay, based on the numbers of openings, based on the number of aircraft. Now, keep in mind, a company, an airline, can always go through and determine the number of labor hours they need per aircraft per hour flown. So if I have X amount of aircraft, then I need X amount of pilots to fly them, and I need X amount of mechanics to maintain them, to do their hourly checks and then unscheduled maintenance, over the number of flights flown or cycles flown for aircraft. So it's really, when Boeing does this evaluation, it's based on history and the fact that they've really done a good job of evaluating what it takes to maintain an aircraft and operate an aircraft safely in the system. So they put out this report every few years, and this is the new one for 2022, looking through 2022 through 2041. So it's titled Pilot and Technician Outlook 2022 to 2041. It says basically, as the commercial aviation industry navigates an uneven global recovery from the recent market downturn caused by COVID-19, and now we're going to look at it through the eyes of a recession, effective training and adequate supply of personnel remain critical to maintaining the health, safety, and prosperity of the aviation ecosystem. Long-term demand for newly qualified aviation personnel remains strong, as 602,000 new pilots and 610,000 new maintenance technicians and 899,000 new cabin crew members will be needed to fly and maintain the global commercial fleet over the next 20 years. And I need to stop here. What Boeing is looking at is just the airline aviation industry, the industry that goes through and basically you buy the ticket and get on the airplane, you go from point A to point B, and our promise is that the pilot's well trained, that the aircraft is well maintained, that the mechanics are trained and qualified to maintain the aircraft, and they fly. And the issue is, it doesn't talk about the repair and maintenance repair organizations, the repair stations that actually maintain these aircraft away from the airlines. It doesn't talk about general aviation, corporate aviation, that also has a supply of pilots and a supply of mechanics in that field. So it really only talks about that part of the airline industry that the average person sees, but it really doesn't lead to the real numbers of the demand. So now, if we're talking about 610,000 mechanics and technicians, what we're talking about, and 602,000 pilots, you got to add at least a third to that. So you're talking about 1 million shortage here. So continuing on, meeting projected pilots and aircraft technician and cabin crew demand is wholly dependent on industry's investment in a steady pipeline of newly qualified personnel to replace those who have or will soon leave the industry through retirement, recent layoffs, furloughs, and ongoing attrition. The global aviation industry will need to keep a sharp focus and engage in collective efforts to build a robust, diverse, talented pipeline through more educational outreach and recruitment programs, development of new pathways to aviation careers, investment in early career learning opportunities, and deployment and adaptation of more efficient learning methods. And this is something I need to address later. Opportunities for those aspiring to have an aviation career will abound, while operators will face stiff competition in recruiting and retaining top-tier talent. Now, the thing is, when we talk about the aviation industry, like I said that a lot of these people are retiring because they're getting to the retirement age. But we really haven't been backfilling in the training facilities we need. For the most part, pilots and mechanics, and I can't talk about cabin crew here. Flight attendants are generally trained solely by the airlines that they work for. They could carry experience from something else, but we don't have outside schools or certification for flight attendants per se. But a pilot has to be an individual as a youngster that decides, I want to be a pilot. And even before they make application for the airline years down the road, they have to make that conscious decision to go and say, I need to start flight training. Or am I going to combine it with college? So I'm going to go to college, get my flight training. Then once I'm done with flight training, because of the way the rules are, I have years of time building in different operations before I can even apply to that airline. Airlines right now have a requirement that you have to be an airline transport pilot. And that is a lot of time, money, and investment that really turns off new people. So airline transport's a little different. Airline transport is that once you're done with college, there's your certificates, there's the paperwork in your hand, and now what are you going to do? I need to find a job in a really tough industry that gets me the flight hours. And it kind of turns young people off to say that's a lot of ifs that I need to go through. Plus, at the end, that I can't make that big airline money if I'm saddled now with $150,000 to $200,000 in debt, and I don't have the hours I need to be able to be considered to be able to fly. So it's hard to get people that way. And the fact you look at it, it's an overwhelming challenge. Okay, that's a pilot challenge that's coming up. The maintenance challenge is a little less severe, but it's still a challenge in today's environment with encouraging people to come into the career field. So what I mean to say is that to become an aircraft mechanic or technician, and I have to use the terms interchangeably because we have specialties in aviation maintenance. We consider our mechanics as those that are certificated with A's and P's because those are mechanic license. And then we think of our technicians as the avionics technicians, the ones that don't have FA certification that you would carry to the company. You can get certificated at an airline. That's what a repairman certificate for. But we call them technicians because their job function is different than a maintenance function. But the same problems of getting them into the industry and then having the airlines go through and say, well, that's a challenge to get people in, is they don't understand what it takes to attract these people and to make them spend, for example, for an A&P mechanic, the 2 years it takes if you go to a school, or the 3 years it takes to try to work at an apprenticeship. And most airliners are not going to hire apprenticeship mechanics. That I can see starting to change when you look at the numbers here. You're going to have to probably get an apprenticeship program, but that means that the airlines themselves need to start teaching people, we're just human beings, to where when you look at the complexity of a 737, for example, or a 777, or an Airbus, I mean, that's a pretty complicated aircraft. I can't take a person right out of high school or out of the military and say, go fix the airplane. They need to know the basics, which means part of any OJT program would include the same subjects that you would see at a formalized airframe and power plant school. Again, that's a challenge to attract people into the time and effort, or attract the companies into wanting to produce an internship program. That means a really ramping up of their maintenance training programs. So that's a couple challenges. And then we have the work environment. You are competing with new industries. You're competing with work at home people that are doing videotapes on their desks, or they're doing IT work at home in an air-conditioned environment. It's really tough when kids grow up and they're used to being indoors. They're not really used to working outdoors. We don't work on our own cars anymore. There's a few of us that still enjoy outdoor activities. I enjoy riding motorcycles. But to work outside in all weather, the airline industry is 24/7, 365 days a year. That's a hard sell to people. It's a different working environment. It's a harsh working environment. And it's hard to attract people into that career field. What's the benefit at the end? What do I get at the end other than a worn out body? And you still have to kind of go through and try to sell the fact that aviation is really cool. Well, how do I attract new people into the industry to think that's really cool, that working on an aircraft is really neat? I always thought it was. I grew up around airplanes in the industry. So then we'll go back to this. So that's what they mean in that very last sentence where it says, opportunity for those aspiring to have an aviation career will abound. Because then we start saying, okay, I've got terrible working environments. The schedules are horrible. At least that's perceived. I never thought they were that bad. But at the end, okay, what can you do to attract people into it? And that's just it. It's going to be stiff competition in recruiting and retaining top tier, which means it's going to be expensive. that cost is carried over to the traveling public. But in reality, when you talk about the overall cost of an aircraft, the cost of your pilots and mechanics and technicians, your flight attendants, and your baggage handlers and everything that goes with that is comparable to what the rest of the aircraft costs. In fact, it starts to get a little bit upside down as the airplane starts getting older and it's more labor intensive. So that's the incentive. The incentive is going to be much higher pay. If you pay them, they will come. And that's true. But then it's not a matter of just putting the high money out and attracting people in. It's going to be up to the airlines themselves to determine if those people have the ability to do that. Those in this industry who emerge from market downturns have historically resumed their growth trajectory through collaboration, adaptation, and innovation. To address the challenges created during the COVID-19 pandemic, the training industry is adopting increasingly innovative solutions. Many training providers have transitioned their offerings to online and virtual formats, and where possible, allowing students to continue their learning safely and remotely. Immersive technologies, adaptive learning, and flexible distance learning methods have allowed the training pipeline to remain intact while evolving how training is delivered. Continued investments in these technologies will likely lead to long-term fundamental shifts in how training is conducted. Getting back to that comment I had earlier about people being used to being in front of the TV or being used to in front of the game and things, they would accept some of the basic minimal as far as what the regulations are, some process and procedures. But when you think about airline pilots or pilots in general or mechanics in general, it's a tactile job. It requires, yes, you need to know the basics, but also requires muscle memory. What does it feel like to put on a brake on a 737? How heavy is it? What's it feel like to put that bolt in? It's hard for me to describe how heavy this thing is on a description on an iPad. I could do it for the basics, especially when we talk about how to find the maintenance manuals, how to find the parts and materials we need, that research things that are really important for a mechanic. Teaching a pilot the memory items for the emergency checklist, understanding the basic numbers of how to do a weight and balance or takeoff calculation. Fantastic. Online training is great, but it's still not going to replace wholly the actual hands-on tactile training that's going to have to happen. You're going to have some sort of combination of that. So yes, we could go and try to put it all on online training. That's what I do here at Avionics Education. I do both regulatory FAR repair station training, but I also do technical training with my NCAT certification and A&P test prep courses. So I try. I mean, I'm part of that pipeline, but I also understand that person needs to be able to have an on-the-job training program that allows them to physically perform the task under supervision to supplement this adaptive learning. So yes, maybe when you're sitting at home on or off the clock and doing this training, that you get the basics. But when that person gets to work, and I'm talking about the mechanic now, they need to have something to work on or work with, the feel, the tools, the weights, the torques, all it takes to be a mechanic in a live action. It's doable. It's possible. You just have to emulate that your airline is going to probably have a training program that emulates a mechanic school. Or I taught an avionics system program, which means I had a curriculum that trained technicians on the basics of electricity and how a cockpit is laid out and where things are, to hands-on with the test equipment. Here's an airplane. Here's my box. Set it up and go to work. So we're going to have to transition to both. We can't solely make a pilot or solely make a technician online. But we are going to use those adaptive tools and those training techniques to help them along. So let's finish the last paragraph here. says training methods also continue to progress toward holistic approaches that focus on competencies rather than prescriptive tasks. As commercial operators and training providers look toward the future, we expect to see continued investment in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and mixed reality technologies that will help tomorrow's students more quickly, efficiently, and effectively learn more quickly, efficiently, and effectively. And this will lead to better, safer, and more efficient aviation industry. I'm an old timer. I'm probably not going to go through and be able to translate in my head. To me, holistic means something different than probably to somebody who's a Gen Xer. But I'm also an aircraft mechanic and I'm a pilot, and I understand the system. And yes, we can go through and create or use automation and I might say artificial intelligence, but what task can we or what machine can we create that replaces the human being? And we have been for years in the aviation industry. When we go through and look at the original China Clippers, they had 10 people on board, including stewards. And they had a radio operator, a navigator. They had, a flight engineer. You had 2 pilots. It was automation that reduced that crew to the 2 that we have today. Remember, the 747 came out as a 3-person crew. Now there are no aircraft that are certified with the 3rd pilot or the flight engineer's position. It was automation that has done that. But when we talk about the maintenance side of it, what can we do in maintenance to better automate or try to replace a mechanic? And we used to have a joke that's on my website. It says, someday the airplane may come into the gate fully loaded with passengers with no pilot on board. But it certainly won't leave the gate unless a technician gets it ready. So it'll always have technicians to get the aircraft ready to fly. What level of knowledge they need to have, who knows, because the aircraft are self-diagnosing these days. We are making it easier as long as the wires remain good. As long as the boxes can talk to each other, then there's a lot of stuff that we do in maintenance that is less labor intensive when it comes to system troubleshooting for avionics, for example, than we did in the past when we had to troubleshoot broken wires, leaky hydraulics, things like that. Today, the aircraft kind of tells us what's wrong when it comes to the boxes themselves. As the aircraft get older, that goes away. Now we have to look at the aircraft and system aging. Again, we have to teach that to our technicians. So this is not surprising. When we go through and look at the pilot technician output for 2041, we knew that there was going to be a shortage. There was a big shortage. When you're talking close to 1 million people in an industry, and these aren't low competency, low trained individual. This is a highly skilled environment, especially if the aircraft are getting more and more complex. So they take a lot of investment from not only the person themselves to get to a position higher of the airline, but also takes a lot of investment from the airline themselves not to do damage, not to have these people do damage to the aircraft. So training is going to be one of the key points to see who survives and who dies, or let me rephrase that, who no longer stays in business. We don't like to talk about people dying. So thank you for sticking with me too long. I'm hoping that that's kind of at least start some conversation of how are we going to attract people into this industry? Because quite frankly, I don't believe airplanes are going to go away because taking the bus really stinks. So we're always going to still have airplanes. We're going to still try to fly. And we're still going to need these people for us to do that. So we're going to have to go there and find out what's it going to take. Hey, thank you for sticking with the video this long. If you like it, hit the like button, hit the share button to anybody that you think you want to go and get into aviation. One other thing I need to point out right now is I plan to actually go back on this video. I actually plan to do a live stream on Friday night, 7 p.m. Central Time, coming up on July 29th. Want to be my first live stream. I've never really did a live stream when we talked about the industry. But I'm going to carry on with what we talked about here today with the Boeing report. We're going to talk about, well, picking on the aircraft maintenance side. I'm not going to talk about the pilots so much. But I'm talking about, well, what decisions does somebody coming out of high school today, if they even remotely want to think about a career in aviation, knowing that that money is going to be there? If it's going to be a high-paid job, and $100,000 right now is not uncommon for an aircraft mechanic, plus 6 figures where we're at on mechanics, and it may be higher than that in the future, then the trick is, how do we attract the people? So I'll talk about the work environments, the different types of work there is in the environment, in the industry, a little bit about pay, and also about the certification. What does it take to get qualified to work in the aviation industry? So hopefully I'll see you here on Friday. Pass the word around about the live feed. Again, this is my first, so be gentle with me. And I'm a one-person show here, so it's really going to be kind of like this. It's going to be kind of like a little bit flaky as far as when it runs. And I actually see, people talk about their first videos on YouTube being horrible. This is my first live stream, other than I did for a connector that was totally unplanned. It was sort of I want to say a fluke, because it was a class that I did pretty much every day when I was at school and I taught at college. But now this type of environment's a little bit different. So we'll see you on Friday. Also, don't forget to like and share this video. Come on and spread the word a little bit. I'm up to almost 2,000 subscribers right now, which is, I know it's nothing in the YouTube world, but it makes me feel good. So I like being able to help people out there. So keep it safe, and until the next one, see you later.